ladies and gentlemen. We are now in 2021. 10 years ago, in 2011, the world was slowly recovering from the global financial crisis. The United States had a strong run as the hegemonic power and then as the predominant power in the world. But in 2008-2009, it was grappling with the devastating collapse of the mortgage industry and the financial industry, that is Wall Street, which needed a massive bailout with knock-on effects for Main Street. Europe was exposed to the same financial crunch, and countries in Asia, including Singapore, that were very open, felt the effects and the financial crisis. During and after the global financial crisis, the United States came to the realization that China's capability had reached a critical mass as to challenge, and that's the military and technological capability and the economy, had reached a critical mass as to challenge American dominance. China, too, has been activist. China emerged in American calculations as a peer competitor for global influence and standing. The definition of China as a strategic adversary for the United States crystallized in 2017 with the Trump administration. President Xi's ambitious plans and visions for China were viewed as a strategic challenge to the United States. And from 2018 till today, we have seen the US-China relationship deteriorate and deteriorate rapidly, from a trade war to an investment war and a tech war, and possibly a real war. Differences of values have now been brought into the equation, and talk is common about the coming Cold War and whether we are already in it. Now, fast forward to 2021 with the COVID pandemic. This is the theme of the Regional Outlook Forum 2021, Power, Policy, and Politics in the Post-COVID World. Analysts believe geopolitical trends have accelerated developments. The one new factor is the election of Joe Biden in 2020 as the 46th President of the United States. Will anything change with his administration? We have read Foreign Minister Wang Yi's signal on 2 occasions to the Biden team that China would like to work with the United States. Will that happen? And how will US-China tensions be managed? Our first plenary session on managing US-China relations will hear 3 perspectives from China, the United States, and India. We have as our first speaker, Professor Wang, Professor and Executive Director of the Institute for Global Cooperation, Beijing University. Our second speaker is Dr. Zack Cooper, a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He works on foreign and defense policy. And our third speaker is Mr. Shivshankar Menon, one of India's most distinguished diplomats and former NSC advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He is presently with Ashoka University. Now let us hear from them without delay. Professor Wang Dong, the floor is yours.
To speak at the Regional Outlook Forum 2021. In my presentation today, first of all, I think I would like to take a step back to comment on a debate on the structure versus agency explanation vis-a-vis the origins of the Cold War, or the debate about the so-called new Cold War. So we all know that now a virtual consensus now exists within the U.S. foreign policy establishment that the 4 decades-long U.S. engagement strategy toward China has failed. And the U.S.-China relations should now be defined as one of quote-unquote strategic competition. Indeed, the hawks in the United States are openly advocating a new Cold War against China. There is actually a time-honored debate in philosophy and social sciences. What explain societal or state behavior, structure or agency, or ideas? So why were the United States and the Soviet Union trapped in the Cold War? Was it determined by structure or agency? When it comes to U.S.-China relations, most analysts seem to uh, take the structural explanation for granted, and therefore accept U.S.-China strategic competition as a given. However, there are at least, I think, two problems in the structural explanation. First, the structural argument is unable to account for timing. For example, why did the paradigm shift, so to speak, in U.S. policy toward China not materialized a few years ago? Why will it not take place in the future or a few years later? Why now? So has the objective distribution pattern of the distribution of interest between China and the United States undergone some fundamental changes in the past few years? That seems hardly to be true. Therefore, such changes must be attributed to changes in perceptions of China's intention, rather than to objective changes in China's capability that have caused Washington to abandon the engagement strategy. Second, acceptance of structural explanation creates a sense of inevitability, which might provoke players toward preemption, causing both parties to race for a preemptive edge, and thereby accelerating the dynamics of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Typically, this sort of mindset is manifested in the thinking of American super hawks who view complete decoupling as an effective preemptive measures against a rising and expansionist China. The logic appears to be that 10 years from now, the United States will not have the capacity to reclaim its lost leadership. Therefore, it is better to initiate action now rather than later. On the other hand, Chinese nationalists believe Washington is determined to confine China via containment. As a corollary, they argue that it is best to begin preparations to tackle worst-case scenarios. Political scientists and historians have identified agency factors or cognitive errors that help explain the origins of the Cold War. One such cognitive error is called attribution bias. The US policymakers tended to attribute their own behavior to situational requirements or as something compelled by circumstances, while attributing Soviet behavior to Moscow's dispositional characteristics or its ideological expansionist motives. Officials in Washington were convinced that the United States was entitled to build a strategic sphere of influences in the Western Hemisphere, militarily dominate the Eurasia rimlands, and develop an extensive system of alliances and forward deployed bases. On the other hand, the very US officials would view Moscow's efforts to establish a Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe or Soviet diplomatic overtures to acquire a limited number of bases as reflecting long-term aggressive intentions of the Soviet Union to gain domination of the world. Sadly, the same social psychological mechanism is at play in contemporary interactions between China and the United States. When China follows the United States, its NATO allies, and even Japan and India by establishing a moderate supply base in Djibouti, it is viewed as evidence of Chinese expansionism designed to dominate the globe, whereas Washington tends to view the over 600 military bases it has built around the globe, including the 261 bases the United States has deployed in the Western Pacific as pillars for maintaining regional and global peace and stability. In other words, very much like officials in the Truman administration, contemporary U.S. strategic and policy analysts, planners tend to ascribe aggressive intentions to China's actions, actions that are in fact akin to America's own and driven by similar security calculations. In other words, agency factors are important in explaining the origins of the old Cold War, so to speak. While, on the other hand, if history is any guide, structural factors alone cannot predetermine the unfolding of a new Cold War. Finally, I would like to make three quick observations. First, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there is still possibility that a new equilibrium in U.S.-China relations might be restored by, of course, first and foremost, or among other things, the restoration of a new trade relationship that can serve as a new ballast for U.S.-China relations. Instead of decoupling, we should, in fact, try to recouple or relink the two economies on the basis of reciprocity, respect of rules, and mutual benefits. Several recent developments are actually signs of encouragement. Number one, the conclusion of the ICEP. Second, number two, indication by Chinese President Xi Jinping that China is actively considering joining CPTPP. And number three, the conclusion of the BIT negotiations between China and EU, or added up together, are an encouraging sign that some of the most outstanding differences between Beijing and Washington, and of course, by extension, its Western allies such as the state subsidies, industrial policies, intellectual property protections, and state-owned enterprises, etc., might be resolved peacefully, therefore paving the way for arriving at a new equilibrium in U.S.-China relations in the years to come. Second, the election of Joe Biden as next U.S. presidency provide a window of opportunity, although I think the window of opportunity might not be very long. It might just be a little bit more than a year for both sides to work together to improve the bilateral relations. Several constraints. Number one, the severe damage the Trump administration has done to U.S.-China relations. Number two, I think the current China narrative in the United States is far from a rational one. Rather, it is a mixture of fear, prejudices, misperception, self-righteousness, and even paranoia. China bashing now, unfortunately, has become a political correctness in the United States. And some might even argue the similar tendency is also on the rise in China as well. Number three, populism in the United States and nationalism in China provides another constraint on the policymakers on both sides to try to take measures, steps to improve the bilateral relations. Third, and finally, looking forward, I think the real competition between China and the United States in the 21st century is not about how to contend for primacy or dominate the international system. Rather, I think the real competition is about how to be a better self. Therefore, rather than blaming others for its own problems or falling captive to fear, paranoia, or self-righteousness, I think both China and the United States should address their domestic challenges, carry out needed reforms, improve domestic governance systems, and deliver better policy outcomes to their respective publics. So, in closing, I'd like to say that I'm cautiously optimistic at the prospect of improvement of U.S.-China relations under the upcoming Biden presidency. It might not be an easy path going forward, but I think nevertheless we have to work together and have a try. After all, I think the stakes are too high for our two countries, for the region, and for the whole world to forego a try. So I will stop here. Angie, going back to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang Dong, for that sharp analysis. I will now call on Professor Dr. Zack Cooper to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. It's wonderful to be able to be with all of you. I very much wish we could be in person, and hopefully that will be able to happen in the not so distant future. I want to pick up on a couple of the points that my friend Wang Dong mentioned, especially his last point about the importance of the United States and China focusing internally on some of the domestic challenges that both of our countries have. Because I think the main takeaway that most countries in Asia and around the world have from the last year of the COVID-19 pandemic is that neither the United States nor China looks particularly capable of either governing domestically or leading internationally. And so I actually think that the effect of the pandemic will be to accelerate the push towards a much more multilateral system than the one that we have been used to, at least over the last few years. And obviously, I think we're seeing the rise of India as a much more important player across the Indo-Pacific region. Japan has stepped up and played a much more active role. Southeast Asia also, of course, is going to be absolutely critical to the future of the Indo-Pacific region. And I actually think that that's where we should often focus. So, many Americans, we love to talk about ourselves, and I'll certainly do a bit of that in the next couple of minutes. But my main takeaway from the pandemic is that actually the United States and China are not the center of gravity in the competition that's happening. The competition is actually centered in Southeast Asia. It's about the decisions, the alignment decisions that Southeast Asian states make and a couple of other states throughout the Indo-Pacific region. And this is where I might have a slight difference of opinion with Professor Wang, which is that I actually think that the damage that's been done to the United States and to China abroad, you see it in polling data, right? And most importantly from ISEAS, which has just done fantastic work on this every year. That data, it doesn't show that the United States has dragged China down or that China has dragged the United States down. I think it's our own leaders. It's Donald Trump in the United States who's done tremendous damage to America's standing, not just in Asia, but in Europe with many of our closest allies and partners. But it's also Xi Jinping who's done remarkable damage to China's standing and wolf warrior diplomacy. And if you look, for example, at polling done by the Pew Group, they have found that in a group of major countries around the world, that Chinese standing is also at its lowest point in years. And I think that's not because of anything Donald Trump did. Many of these countries aren't particular fans of Donald Trump. They don't particularly trust him. I think it's because there's decreasing confidence in Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to try and actually be able to answer the problems that we see in the world today. So bottom line for me is I think we're seeing the lowest levels of confidence in America's ability to lead, but also China's ability to lead after the pandemic. Now, I don't want to be entirely pessimistic about this from an American point of view. We've just had an election here. It's not quite over yet. As some of you may be aware, right now they are counting votes in the state of Georgia here in the United States. My update for you on that is that it looks like it's actually possible that Democrats will win both of those seats, which would mean that Democrats will have won the House, the Senate, and the presidency in the elections this fall. That would be a resounding defeat for Donald Trump. It would be a defeat of America first and many of Trump's policies and those that Republicans have pursued over the last 4 years. If that's the case, I think you have a window of opportunity for Joe Biden to shift the debate on America's role, not just in the world, but in particular in Asia. And here's where I think you could see a very different set of policies on Southeast Asia in particular. Many of you know that Donald Trump was no fan of travel. He didn't like coming to Asia in the first place. He really didn't like coming to Southeast Asia. It's not just that he didn't attend many of the yearly meetings, right? The APEC summits, the US ASEAN summits, and the ARF, among others. He initially tried to go to the first of these summits and then sent lieutenants after that. And that sent a very bad signal about US disengagement with Southeast Asia. As you all know, he also didn't appoint until about a month or two ago anyone to fill the role of US ambassador to ASEAN, or for that matter, to Singapore. And these were all terrible signs about US engagement in the region. I don't think you're going to see this from Joe Biden. Tony Blinken, who is the incoming Secretary of State, he has been very clear in signaling that Southeast Asia is going to be a priority. And I think that's exactly the right choice for the Biden team. And this is where I think they might be able to shift the debate. And here, I think there is a window of opportunity for the Biden team to actually get a little bit of momentum on its strategy in the region. Because obviously Donald Trump is wildly unpopular in the region. Xi Jinping isn't very popular either. But as we saw in the transition from George W. Bush, who I worked for, to Barack Obama, there was a huge outpouring of support for Barack Obama, not just in Asia, but in Europe as well. And I think we're going to see the same thing for Joe Biden. And that will give him a bit of momentum and a bit of ability to, I think, push forward on some key parts of his agenda in the region. And he's been very clear that that agenda means working with allies and partners. And that doesn't have to mean working with allies and partners to oppose anything. We have to work with allies and partners for a positive vision, right? And in Southeast Asia, that means we need to work with Southeast Asian friends, not because it has something to do with China, but because it's good for Southeast Asia and it's good for the United States. And so I think bringing that positive vision back is possible. It's not going to be easy. There's some tough challenges for Joe Biden. For example, should he try and re-enter the CPTPP? It's politically difficult here in Washington, but I think it's absolutely important for US standing in the region. And here's where I think he has a real opportunity to shift the debate. So I agree with Wang Dong that if this is sketched out as a US-China competition, a great power competition, it's not good for the US. It's probably not good for China. At the end of the day, this isn't so much a power competition between two great powers. It's a question of how the world and the region wants to be led. And we see in polling done by ISEAS that actually the region has been pretty happy with the kind of security architecture and economic architecture that the United States has had helped to underwrite in Asia for so long. What they're not happy about is the turn under Donald Trump towards protectionism and towards this America First policy. That, I think, is all going to go away. And so Joe Biden has a real opportunity here to shift the debate. And what I hope he does is try and build 4 different coalitions. And I don't want to suggest that this will be easy. It's going to be incredibly difficult. But I think these 4 coalitions are around issue areas. The first of them for me is around security, around geopolitics in particular. And really it's focused on the Indo-Pacific region. And in many ways, it's focused on dealing with the security implications of China's rise. I think we're already seeing this kind of cooperation through the Quad. And I'll mention, the Quad would not be anywhere near where it is without the 1-2-3 agreement, which was spearheaded, of course, during Foreign Minister, during National Security Advisor Menon's role. So, that was absolutely critical to bring the Quad together in the first place. And it's now been resuscitated into something that's really critical for this security coalition that I think we're starting to see come about. But it can't just be the Quad. It has to be bigger than that. It needs to include Korea. It needs to include countries in Southeast Asia, which are absolutely critical to the security arrangements in the region. So he has to build that security coalition. But that's actually maybe the easiest of the 4 coalitions that he has to build. There's a second one around economics, which I think is hard to build, but really critical. And this is where the Europeans have a really important role to play in trying to make sure that we have a fair playing ground on economics, pushing back against unfair state subsidies, intellectual property theft, corruption, those kinds of activities. That's not pushing back necessarily against China. It's pushing back against what we think is unfair activity globally by any actor. And I think building that coalition out is something that Donald Trump couldn't do because he didn't really believe in building that kind of economic coalition. But it's something that Joe Biden has talked a lot about. So that's a second group. A third group in my book is a technology coalition. And we've already seen some of this start to come about around the T12 group that some people have talked about. Basically a grouping of technologically advanced countries that want to ensure that there is an open and free internet, among other issues. And I think that technology grouping is going to be absolutely critical to ensure that a lot of democracies can keep pushing forward with their interests and objectives, not just in the technology area, but also to protect their own democracies at home as well. And then finally, I think there's a broader governance coalition that Biden needs to build. And that governance coalition, it's not just about democracy. After all, many of our closest friends in Asia are not actually democracies. This is about how the world wants to be governed, right? What are the basic rules which we think should govern interactions on the global stage? And I think, again, Joe Biden is pretty well placed to have this debate and discussion and try and bring countries together. I think we're already seeing some of this around the D10 grouping that the British have tried to create, basically the G7 plus India, South Korea, and Australia. But it's going to have to be an expanded discussion. So where I hope the Biden administration goes, and I think we've seen some positive signs so far, is towards trying to build out these coalitions on security, on economics, on technology, and then finally on governance. And if it can do that and sketch out a positive agenda for not just Asia, but for the world, I think the US has a real chance of using this window of opportunity to pick up the mantle of leadership that, frankly, in many ways, it's put down over the last few years. But as I said at the beginning, this is not going back to the world that existed 5-10 years ago. This is a new world. It's going to be a much more multilateral world. And the US is going to have to be used to not just devolving some of that power to allies and partners, but to giving them a greater say in all of the elements of this system. And I think that's something that's hard for Americans to get used to, but is going to be absolutely critical in the years ahead. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Ambassador, and thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zack. You've kept a good time too, as did Wang Dong. And both speakers, Professor Wang and Dr. Cooper, have in fact laid out some ideas about really the path forward, whether it's about managing relations, but certainly a way to move forward, which was not like what it was before. So in that sense, I would say it is managing US-China relations, and we can talk about that later. The third speaker is Mr. Shivshankar Menon. Shiv, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Chan. And my job is actually very easy because I agree with much of what's been said before me. But what I thought I'd do is try and give you a sort of perspective from how does it look from New Delhi, where we are and where I think we might be going, and then make maybe 3 general points about how we might be trying to improve our future. So where are we now? As Ambassador Chan said, COVID has accelerated geopolitical trends that we already had. But I think it has diminished all powers and has forced all powers, all the great powers, into a much more detailed consideration of their domestic issues. It's actually made politics much more fraught within and between powers and countries, and has created a real risk of the fragmentation of the global economy into bubbles, whether it's 3 large blocks, RCEP, Asia, NAFTA successor, North America, the EU, and you see the greater powers, whether it's China, the larger economies, all of them now stressing self-reliance, trying to look inwards for the sources of growth. in an interesting way, China-US contention intensified, but then created space for others, for local initiatives, and initiatives of all kinds. If you look at the conclusion of the RCEP, for instance, if you look at what happened on the India-China border, the tension and the clashes, these are all, in a sense, a localization and space within the international system, which I don't think existed before. It's a result of the acceleration that we've faced in 2020. But by the end of the year, and the other thing that I think COVID brought us was the prospect of the Biden administration. Given how close the US election was, I think we probably owe what Zack was just mentioning, the House, the Senate, and the presidency to the Democrats, maybe to COVID itself. But this, from the outside, looks like a liberal restoration. And like all restorations, whether Meiji, Tongzhi, Stuart, whatever, restorations go through sort of three phases. An initial mild inclusive phase, then the shock of discovering how much the world has changed, because I think the Biden administration comes back to a very different world from what maybe the second Obama administration faced. And then the hunt for the king's killers, I mean, the vengeance phase, when things get actually more difficult. And frankly, it's very hard to say how restorations work, how quickly the new administration will adjust to the new realities of power, of economics. On economics, already in 2019, the IMF says China was responsible for something like over 30% of the world's economic growth. Thanks to COVID, China is the only major economy that at the end of 2020 can say that it grew during the year. And frankly, the world is going to be much more dependent on the Chinese economy as countries look to resuscitate their economies from the crash of 2020. Politically, I think the biggest difference that the Biden administration will find is actually in how much politics is now actually bringing economics, is actually threatening economics. That the politics of the region have actually become much more fraught. But most important, the main geopolitical issues throughout the region are no longer susceptible to solutions, even if China and the US agree on them. Think of the issues that we face. Look at North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Look at Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, the dispute. Look at South China Sea. Look at the Taiwan issue. Look at the India-China border issue. Even if China and the US find congruence, and they do have congruence on desiring a nuclear weapon-free North Korea, they can't bring it about. Kim Jong-un is not going to give up what he sees as the guarantee of his regime and his staying in power. And this is true of most of the geopolitical fault lines. So the biggest change that the Biden administration will probably discover is the diminished capacity of the great powers. And I think Wang reminded us of the lessons of the Cold War. I think the Cold War also teaches us this very interesting lesson that, frankly, no matter how much the gap between the top two and the rest in terms of power and ability, not only do others have agency, but sometimes the tail wags the dog. You saw this in the Korean War, you saw it in Vietnam, you see there are, multiple examples through history. So my point is simple. We're at a stage where multiple actors have agency. This doesn't mean that they have the ability to run or manage the international system anymore in the way that we maybe were used to and the predictability that we had. Secondly, and this brings me actually to what I expect in the future. So what I would expect is an amelioration in China-US ties. I think both sides have signaled that. President-elect Biden has said quite clearly that he regards China not as a threat, but as a competitor. And that's something that can be managed. And I think many of the things that Wang mentioned, that Zack mentioned, these are ways forward in terms of managing China-US contention. And it should be possible to ameliorate that, that contention and the level of competition that we see between the two of them. But I think the effect of that amelioration is not going to be to solve all the geopolitical issues and fault lines that we face, or to reduce the risks to the economy that we see. Where do I think that the Asian economy is going? I actually believe, quite frankly, that we are likely to see a relatively quick recovery and a bounce back, because what we've had is a demand shock, and demand can pick up much quicker. It's not a supply shock. It's not the kind of structural crash that we faced in previous cases. So if there is an amelioration in China-US relations, I think the first place where we can see the benefits of that will be a restoration of growth in the world economy. But the risk is that the politics is pulling us in the other direction. We've heard about populism, we've heard about nationalism, and the fact that the issues themselves are no longer quite so amenable to being handled by the international system. And frankly, the kind of leadership that we've seen across the world during the pandemic gives me very little reason to hope for a return to any kind of constructive multilateralism, even though for years now, I've been actually advocating the idea of issue-based coalitions, the problems that we have. So in a sense, I'm echoing Zack here. And that's what I like, but do I think it's about to happen? I'm not so sure. I'm afraid I'm an optimist about the global economy. I'm less optimistic about our geopolitical prospects, but I am fairly pessimistic, quite frankly, about the international system or world order as a whole. I'll stop there and maybe leave it to the question and answers.
Very fine reading and nuanced reading of the geopolitical landscape. And I was going to say that, it was good to hear a sort of optimistic, a bit of an upbeat reading and analysis from you, though you ended by saying you're a bit pessimistic about some things towards the end. Well, I would thank the three speakers for their eloquent interventions. Before we go into Q&A, let me say that ISEAS has prepared an online poll, which they will now just initiate, and you will be asked to participate and answer some of those questions. So ISEAS, are you ready to start the poll? And I think that will take the audience a bit of time. But in the meantime, as you are filling out ticking off the boxes and responding, let me just throw a round of questions to our three speakers. The topic for today is really managing US-China tensions. What is a new normal? And there have been ideas about what to do and the path forward, different things that we can do. I want to ask Professor Wang Dong, what is China looking for in a bilateral relationship with the United States that you will call well-managed? In other words, what constitutes a well-managed relationship for China?
Thank you, Angie. I think this is a very important question. Perhaps a lot of us here in China also trying to find out. there were a number of things. First of all, I think it has to be a well-managed or a healthy relationship between China and the United States. First of all, I think it should not be ideology driven. In other words, it should be a pragmatic relationship. And secondly, number two, I think the competition between China, the competition will have to be well managed. In other words, there should be a bottom line. I think what we have seen in the witnesses in the past few years, what the Trump administration has been pursuing is really a strategic competition with China with no sort of limits. That's the reason why so many of us are worried about the possibility of China and the United States falling into a new Cold War. So we have to sort of draw a line saying, yes, there's competition, but it has to be a constructive one, and it has to be bounded. There has to be a boundary for the competition, and it cannot, escalate into a new Cold War. And thirdly, I think it is also first and foremost, as I just mentioned in my presentation, I think to really try to resolve some of the outstanding differences, begin with in economic and trade. I think most of the problem between our two countries actually stem from the economic and the trade domains. So we have to look at those issues, face them sort of squarely, and come to try to resolve those differences in a constructive manner. And that's why I'm a bit of optimistic about the possibility of resolving those differences, perhaps not in a few months, but relatively longer term. I think there's as long as we both are rational and both putting, sort of thinking the bigger picture, I think that there's possibility that we will be able to restore a new equilibrium.
Thank you. Thank you, Wang Dong. Now, Zack, I'm going to throw the same question to you, but from the US perspective. What is the United States looking for in a bilateral relationship with China that you would consider well managed?
It's really interesting. So I'm going to have a bit of a different answer from that of Wang Dong. So I think the best we can hope for over the next couple of years is to manage a handful of difficult issues. And I think he's exactly right that, the trade and investment relationship is probably the top one to manage. It is the biggest stressor over the last couple of years. But I actually think from an American standpoint, it's not the most important. I think what's really changed the debate in the United States has mostly been about an assessment of the fact that China and the United States don't share values in a whole set of areas. And so what's been happening in Hong Kong and what is happening just the last few hours in Hong Kong with the arrests, what's been going on in Xinjiang, pressure over Taiwan on the Sino-Indian border, South China Sea, these things have all contributed to a view in Washington that actually the US and China, it's not just that they have different views of the security order or the economic order, but they have different core values. And that I don't think that is going away anytime soon. And my guess is actually that we're going to hear maybe more about this from the Biden team, right? So whereas President Trump was willing to say in private, reportedly to Xi Jinping, basically, look, whatever happens in Xinjiang, that's yours to deal with. Same thing on Hong Kong. You're not going to hear that from Joe Biden. So I think the best you're going to hope for over the next couple of years is the US is going to talk a lot about human rights. We're going to talk a lot about democracy. That is not an issue that's going to be solved in the US-China relationship. You might be able to address some of the US concerns about things like intellectual property theft and state subsidies. We might be able to address some of the issues around military exchanges. But I think, unfortunately, I'm pretty pessimistic about the bilateral relationship. Probably the biggest area, the biggest opportunity to push forward is on climate change. And I think you could see some real progress there, especially since John Kerry is going to be in a leading role working that issue for the Biden team. But I don't think we're going to see the Biden administration link climate change to the broader US-China relationship. I think they're going to keep it largely separate. So basically, I think we're going to see different issue sets that are all going to be siloed and different amounts of cooperation in each of them. But I'm pretty pessimistic that we'll see, a reversion to where things were 3 or 4 years ago. I think we're in a new world, and it's going to be really hard to get away from that trajectory that we've gotten onto.
Thank you, Zack. Shiv, I would like to ask you which side India is going to take, but I would also throw you another question. You've heard what Zack has said and what Wang has said. Do you think peaceful coexistence or competitive coexistence is possible? Because Zack has highlighted values as a differentiator and a problematic differentiator.
Well, will India choose any side? The short answer is no. I don't think it serves India's purpose, frankly, for 3 reasons. One is, we've seen what polarized politics has done domestically. The last thing we want to do is to do that globally or internationally. I mean, all of us have seen it, whether it's the US, China, India, we've seen what it does to us at home. We don't want to do that, repeat that. 2, it doesn't serve India's interest. Theoretically, in the India-China-US sort of triangle, and this is not a new triangle, it's been going on since the 50s. The ideal position for India is to have better relations with the US and China than they have with each other. Now, that's not too difficult in today's situation. But that's not, I think, frankly, if you regard it as a triangle. And my own feeling is, in today's world, where things are much more complicated, where you're economically much more interdependent, where China is your biggest trading partner in goods, but the US is your biggest trading partner overall, where you're linked through technology, you name it. Ideologically, clearly, your preference, India's preference is with democracy. This becomes a very difficult choice. So it's not a simple binary choice. Are you going with China? Are you going with the US? And I don't think they see it in those terms either, neither the US nor China. About peaceful coexistence, though, my answer is yes. I think it's possible. But it's possible for the same reasons that kept the peace between the superpowers during the Cold War. They don't stand to gain by conflict between themselves. But that doesn't prevent conflict at lower levels. This idea that the Cold War was a long peace is a myth. I mean, the killing fields were all in Asia. And if you look at the numbers of casualties, battle deaths, etc., I mean, they were enormous. So, but the great powers, the superpowers, kept the peace among themselves. And my own expectation is that so long as no great power today can see gains from conflict or feels completely boxed in, we will avoid great power conflict. But that doesn't mean we're going to avoid flashpoints, the kinds of things, clashes that happened on the India-China border, for instance, in 2020, or other kinds of flashpoints from exploding. But I do think peaceful coexistence between the great powers, and I'm qualifying this, that is possible. Below that, however, I expect turbulence. Also because I think, even China-US relations, the progressives in the US bring to the table several complications, including human rights and so on, to that bilateral relationship. So peaceful coexistence on the terms that Wang described it, competition with limits, competition within boundaries, within agreed boundaries. I think that should be, frankly, what we should all aim at. I'd even say that India-China relations should aim at something like that while we reset them in post the 2020 crisis. And I think that's not a bad pattern to try and follow on the larger scale as well.
Thank you very much, Shiv. Now, I wonder if the results are ready, and could we see this flashed on the screen? Now, the Question 2, the Biden administration's biggest challenge in formulating a successful policy toward Asia will be, and the answer is reestablishing confidence in the United States in the region. That's what the, I guess the plurality of the votes show. 21%, that's 31%. 21% thinks that engaging with the Xi administration in China is the biggest challenge, and not grasping the region has changed over the past 4 years. Only 9% think so, and not being overwhelmed by the U.S. pressing domestic challenges. Oh, that is the biggest challenge for the Biden administration. 38% think that. Now, for the next question, the Xi administration's biggest challenge in formulating a successful policy toward Asia will be, oh, can you please move the slide? I can't move it. Yes. The biggest challenge for the Xi administration in formulating a successful policy toward Asia will be, 1, establishing trust in China in the region. 65% of the respondents think that is the most important challenge, establishing trust in China in the region. The second challenge is engaging cooperatively with democracies with significant economies such as Japan, Australia, India, and Indonesia. 25% think that. 2% think that reinvigorating the Belt and Road Initiative is the biggest challenge, and 8% think reassuring countries in the region that they will not be affected by decoupling of production networks. Now, the third, I can't seem to move this. Oh, this doesn't move. Can you help me, please? The Modi administration. The Modi administration's biggest challenge in formulating a successful foreign policy will be, and most people chose, retaining a global perspective in the face of many issues in its immediate neighborhood. So it's really being caught up in the neighborhood that will distract the Modi administration. Second reason, the second biggest challenge for a successful foreign policy for Modi is re-establishing confidence in India's commitment to regional economic integration. And third, engaging with the Xi administration over land border issues, only 13% thought that was the biggest challenge, and engaging with the incoming Biden administration, 6%. So that is the poll, and I'm repeating this because the speakers are not able to see the poll results. So now, can we have the Q&A, please? There are 3 questions now. Let me see. Oh, this is a long question from Marielle Demongeau. Demongeau is a French name, I think. How do you expect the climate change issue to play in the US-China relationship? Many see it as an area where the two countries can cooperate, but there is a risk that China may use it to detract attention away from trade tensions and human rights. Could it be an area of competition too between the two countries as they seek to dominate the environment sector and smart technologies? Now, I think any one of our 3 speakers can answer that question. Although I think it was touched upon, Zack said, do not expect climate change to be part of this larger US-China relationship. It's separate. So maybe Zack, you'd like to go first? How will it play?
Absolutely.
The climate?
And I think it's a perfect question, and we don't really know exactly what the answer is the bottom line. So I'll give you the two schools of thought here in Washington. One is that John Kerry is going to be a very influential figure in this administration. We don't know exactly how influential, but it's definitely possible that as a former Secretary of State and a Democratic presidential candidate, that he could have a lot of sway with Joe Biden. And that, yes, this might be the best way for China to push forward on a cooperative relationship with the United States, try and cooperate on climate change. And I absolutely think there will be a lot of effort, both by Beijing and by Washington, to come up with some kind of deal on the climate. As John Kerry has said, we can't address the climate change issue without having both the US and China on board. But I also think what's more likely now is that the US is going to segment that discussion off from the discussion it's going to have on some other issues. And I think we've seen this in general over the last 2 years, where it used to be that the US was basically always trying to engage China, or under the Trump administration, always trying to punish China across the board, right? Broad incentives or broad punishments. Now we're seeing a move toward much more targeted measures on technology issues, on economic issues, on human rights issues. And I think you're going to see that as a result, the US doesn't need to have this sort of broad grand bargain where it trades a deal on climate change for a more quiet US position on South China Sea issues or Taiwan issues or human rights issues. I think you'll see the US say, okay, we'd like a deal on climate change also. It has to be a fair deal for both countries. But we don't need to give up our concerns on other areas to try and come towards a deal on climate with China. So I think that's the most likely outcome in my view.
Right. Actually, maybe Wang Dong would like to answer that too. But I hope, Zack, from what you say, it's not just going to be an issue of a deal between US and China. I hope US and China can do something for the whole world, because climate change is really a global issue, and we would like to see both powers work together, and certainly the US to come back to the Paris Agreement. And because a lot of the third world countries, the developing countries, really depend on the technology, the assistance that can be provided by the United States. Yeah, Wang Dong, would you care to say something?
Yes, I'll be happy to add up to Zack's comments here. Well, first, I think climate change is precisely the kind of issue area where positive sum perspective should be applied. So in other words, it's not really who China dominate the issue or the United States dominate the issue, but rather the two have to, and along with other stakeholders, will have to work together to address this issue. As Heng just indicated, this is a true, real global challenge facing, I think, the whole humankind. So there's no escape for any of us with regard to that. And I think that probably is right. I think, I also suspect that the Biden administration might take a more sort of targeted or separate this climate issue from other issues. I think that is fine. I think that is not a problem from the Chinese perspective, because my sense is that what Beijing wants is that, let's really get the so to speak, this house sort of in order, right? Because he's been Trump like just the bull running into a shop, and every smash all the goods in the store, and we have to restore the order. We have to clean it up a little bit, and then we have to start with something. And climate change will be a very good starting point. And then of course simultaneously as well, economy and trade, and how to try to resolve those issues as well. And in fact, one last point, I would argue that I actually do think this is my personal observation. I'm not sure um, everyone agrees with me, but what I see over the years here in China is that I think the climate change issue in a way, really been internalized both at the public level and also among the elite level, the official level as well, as a kind of value that China should stand for. It's not just, and of course for interest as well. And the reason being that when you look at the China's measures, policies, oftentimes China is doing that, quote unquote, against its own interest of economic growth. First, shutting down a lot of factories that do not meet the environmental, protection standard, right? And that's hurting economic growth in a short run. But I think there's a broader consensus now emerging here in China at the social level and at the policy level that this is something is in China's longer sort of term interest. And of course, economists also trying to argue. I've seen some Chinese economists working on some very fantastic models trying to argue throw in hundreds of different variables and trying to argue that as long as you pursue climate change, overall, in the long term, it will be beneficial for China. So I actually encourage them to come up with a model that to argue for, in the long term, this is beneficial for every country, not just beneficial for China. So what I'm trying to suggest that even when it comes to like the more sensitive and more difficult area, like Zack just indicate, like a value, I think there's still a possibility for figuring out finding common ground, I think, between China and the United States. So what I'm trying to say is that it's don't give up hope. I'm trying to be sort of optimistic here. Of course, I'm also being pragmatic at the same time.
Thank you. Shiv, I would like to shift the ground now, and ask you to answer the next question posed by Kevin Chan. And ready to get India's view on this. Do you think the world splits between US-led tech and China-led tech? Because India is also a country that is, really quite advanced and carrying out, your research in technology and development. So what is your view? Will the world split into US-led tech and China-led tech? And how does India look on it? And really, Kevin Chan wants to know, how does the ASEAN 10 navigate the landscape? But can you begin with India? And if you have advice for the ASEAN 10, that would be great.
Well, I'll stay clear of the advice because, frankly, people know their own business better than I do. But is the world about to split? I think frankly, the signs are at one stage there was a real risk of technological decoupling, as it were. But I don't think it's as likely today. And in some ways, strangely, the economic crash of 2020, what the pandemic did, actually makes it less likely. Because if governments want to get their economies going, if they want to stand their economies up again, technology is going to play a big part in this. We've already moved towards digitalization. And if we now start breaking the world down further, there is a certain amount of decoupling that's already happened. There are two internets, there are, whether we like it or not. But frankly, we can live with some of it. We live with 110 volts, 220 volts. These days, we don't even think when we plug our computers in around the world about what the voltage is, because there are technological fixes for that kind of nationalism, which is what it was, frankly. And so I don't expect technological decoupling to go beyond a point in the short term. In the longer term, unfortunately, I think what's happened in the last 4 years, is a fundamental breakdown of trust. And you hear this where everybody is seeking self-reliance, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's the US, which is protecting its technological leads. And that quest for self-reliance is going to lead to an attempt to create separate, as I like to call them, multiverses of their own, which will interact with each other, but they will try and maintain their own control and autonomy, as it were, from each other. So in the longer term, it's a real risk, but I don't think it's a short-term risk right now. In fact, I think the risks of technological decoupling have gone down in the last year or so.
Thank you, Shiv. Now, time is running out, and I still have, one or two other questions. So, would Zack or Wang like to say something about this topic? Do you think the world will split between US tech and China tech? But 1 minute each if you choose to speak, because we have to get on to the next question. Zack, any thoughts? No? Wang Dong, any thoughts?
No, I very much agree with what was already said, so I don't need to add anything.
Right. Thank you very much. Now, the next question comes from Danny Kwa, and he's got a long question, which is really, in light of what has been said, diminished capacity of the great powers, greater significance to what Southeast Asia wants, increase in agency of non-great power states. What examples, historical or institutional, should we look at for how the rest of us outside US and China can best exercise this agency? What historical examples? What should we do? How do you exercise agency? The non-aligned movement or regional groupings like ASEAN or new multilateral institutions to be reconfigured, dispersed decision-making mechanisms, what else? So I would like to invite all three speakers to reflect on this. What are the best ways for the countries to exercise agency if you think about what's happened in the past? Anyone going first? Shiv, you're the multilateral. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we should look at it either as late 19th century Europe, where you locked yourself into alliance systems and looked at security systems, rather hard security systems, or go back to sort of non-alignment worked, frankly, because it was a bipolar world, and it's not a bipolar world today. So I don't think we should look for institutional. I think the better approach is what Zack mentioned and what I was saying, is to look for norms, rules of the road among coalitions of the willing and able, and raise your levels of ambition, frankly. Look at maritime security, for instance. That's positive sum. That is of interest to all of us, China, the US, all of us, ASEAN, and that's something we should all be working on. Cybersecurity, another group of countries has capability and interests. And I think when you take transnational issues, climate change is a very good example, pandemics, on all these, I think you can build different coalitions, which should be open. They should be open to anybody who wants to participate, anybody who can contribute. But I don't think you'll have one architecture. I don't think you can look at, because that's not the world we're in. We're in a world between orders. So there's no way that one single institutional architecture. And to go back to the old multilateral system, after what it did in the last year, I think, frankly, for me, that it would be, reinforcing failure.
Any other ideas from, yes, Zack?
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And I would just add, I've asked this question, what's the right historical analogy? And I don't think there is one that's perfect, because this point that, it's not a bipolar world anymore is exactly right. But The closest analogy that I find, at least from an American point of view, might be sort of 1969, 1970, when President Nixon announced the Guam Doctrine, right? And there was a lot of talk about the United States withdrawing from Asia to some degree, right? And devolving responsibility for Asian problems to the Asians themselves, right? That was the words that Nixon used. And what you see after that event is you see a couple of actions. You definitely don't see a lot of countries hang their hat more on the United States, what I would call anchoring to the United States. You see three other actions that are much more common. You see a pursuit of autonomy, you see augmenting regional relationships, and you see a bit of accommodation. And I think we're seeing all three right now, right? Countries like the Philippines are thinking more about accommodation than they were just a few years ago to China. You're seeing more augmenting of regional relationships. We've seen this obviously with the Quad, but others as well. And then finally, we're seeing more autonomy in the kinds of military capabilities that some states are pursuing, right? Just look at, for example, what Australia has done over the last few years, trying to push military capabilities that give it the ability to protect itself without having to rely entirely on the United States. So I think we're just going to see more of those three kinds of actions. I don't think that's particularly great for the United States. I think it would be much better for the United States if Asia was convinced that the US was going to be a present and active power and a helpful power in a lot of ways. But I think we have to accept that the same kinds of shifts that we saw after the Nixon Doctrine in 1969, we're going to see now. And it's not going to stop the second that Joe Biden comes into office, just like it didn't stop the second that Nixon resigned in the 70s. So I think that's the best period that we should be looking at for an American standpoint to understand how our allies and partners are going to respond to that shock. And I'll just make one last comment. There's some great quotes from Lee Kuan Yew explaining that actually without the Nixon shocks, that ASEAN would never have been forced to come together the way it has. And so I think this is really a moment for ASEAN to show that it can handle some of the problems of the region. Not all of them, not all on its own, but this is a time for smaller countries to come together and show that if the bigger countries can't always lead in the way that they need to, that middle powers can step up.
Right. Now, in the interest of time, and there's so many questions, I just thought, if I may, Wang Tong, I'll move to another question for you, and we can cover more ground. And again, short answers, please. And this is from Yaqub Ibrahim from Singapore. A safe and secure cyberspace should be a universal goal. Given the recent incidents of state actors engaging in cyber offensive tactics, should the United States and China take the lead in establishing the appropriate cyber norms?
Sure, I agree absolutely. I think there's the cyberspace. I think what we are facing now is there's no consensus regarding how what kind of norms we should apply in regulating. I think a lot of different set of levels of behavior. And part of that, it's been sort of being made worse situation by the strategic competition between China and the United States over the past few years. Looking forward, I think absolutely, I think the China, Beijing, Washington, and other stakeholders will have to come together and to work out the set of norms that we can help regulate, I think, the behaviors at the individual level, at the state level, and at the and also at the international level. So this is. I also understand this is a very sensitive and a difficult issue in our bilateral relations between China and the United States. But also, I think this is an area potentially both sides will be able to work out, I think, something quite significant.
Question, Zack, is it possible for US and China to work on cybersecurity, rules of the road?
I'm a little bit more pessimistic, I think, because the Biden team, almost all of it was in place during the Obama years. And I think the experience of 2014, 2015, when the US and China tried to strike this deal on cyber, it's not left a particularly good taste with a lot of those officials. There were some indications that maybe things had gotten a little better initially. But I think not a lot of Americans believe that the deal that Obama and Xi made on cyber really worked effectively for the United States. So I think maybe it's possible to get some sort of minimal rules of the road. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be really hard because our interests are so different, right? I know China is obviously really worried about US espionage, intelligence operations. The US is really worried about Chinese economic actions on this in the cyber domain. And so I think it's hard because what we want to do in the cyber domain is quite different, to actually come together and agree on rules of the road. So maybe something small would be possible, but I'm not quite as optimistic about a large deal to address cyber norms more generally.
Thank you. Now we've really run out of time. Shiv, have you a last word that you want to share with the audience?
Just that I think we start this year much more hopeful than maybe we were a few months ago. And that seems to be largely thanks to the US election. So maybe we should be grateful. But I do think that we do see a way forward with a vaccine, with so on. I think it can be a happy new year.
Thank you very much, Steve. I chose you as the last speaker because you are neutral, So thank you very much to our speakers and to our audience for sharing this session with us. And thank you for really an excellent discussion.